On October 4th, 2021, at 10:43 p.m., police were sent to a disturbance at 407 North Pumphrey Street in Edna, Texas. They had been called to the house when a neighbor called to report a woman screaming. Police discovered an unresponsive 48-year-old woman lying in the front yard. At 11:27 p.m., less than an hour after police arrived at the scene, the woman was pronounced dead from her injuries. She had suffered blunt force trauma. Initially, her identity wasn't disclosed, though it was later revealed that her name was Dolores Saavedra, the estranged girlfriend of Augustine Tristan, who quickly became the suspect of the investigation. Police stated that she was killed by her ex-boyfriend, Tristan. Authorities then traveled to Augustine Tristan's location and called SWAT members of the nearby larger town of Victoria to assist with Tristan's arrest. Relatively little is known about Augustine Tristan's early life, just that he came from the Ganado, Texas area and was nicknamed Augie, at least by people that knew him. He was a displeasure to be around. At the time of the crime, Augustine was about 36 years old, placing his birth year about 1985. Augustine's estranged girlfriend, Dolores Saavedra, was about 10 years his senior and had at least one child from a previous relationship. At some point, Dolores worked at one of the local dentist offices, though I'm unsure of what she did exactly. An article from the Victoria Advocate stated that Dolores was found dead at the scene, having been killed with a crescent wrench. Community members laid out flowers, personal notes, and candles in memory of her on the sidewalk around the house. Dolores was described as having been a kind and welcoming person. One neighbor had recalled, "She would always wave when she drove by. She was a kind soul." An autopsy was to be performed by the Travis County Medical Examiner's Office, though the details were not released to the public. In news articles, Dolores and Augustine Tristan's relationship was described as estranged. On October 5th, 2021, the Victoria Advocate posted a little more about Tristan's past. At the time of the article, he had been charged with murder, and the Texas Rangers were assisting the Edna police with the investigation. Tristan's bond was set at $500,000. His prior history showed that in 2008, he pled guilty to driving while intoxicated. In 2009, Ganado, Texas police arrested and charged Tristan with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, according to the records. He was sentenced to 10 years of deferred adjudication probation. In 2012, he pled guilty again to driving while intoxicated. In 2020, Ganado police arrested and charged Tristan with assault causing bodily injury, and in May of 2021, just months before the murder, Tristan was arrested on suspicion of interfering with an emergency request for assistance. He pled guilty to the charge in July of 2021. I don't know exactly what suspicion of interfering with an emergency request for assistance truly means. I assume that he probably, was trying to keep somebody from calling 911. I'm not really sure. Dolores Melody Saavedra lived with her 12-year-old daughter at the house on Pumphrey Street. At the time of a 2021 article, the daughter was in the care of family members. I couldn't find any burial details nor any information about the autopsy. One site has an obituary that may be about Dolores, though the dates don't seem to match up. Either way, there didn't seem to be an obituary for her in the papers that I could find, and I'm unsure of any burial details for her. There wasn't much in the news between the initial reporting of the crime and the eventual trial that ensued. On May 27, 2022, the Jackson County Herald-Tribune posted an article about the trial and its conclusion. A record of Dolores's voice was played at the trial, the recording dating to October 3, 2021, the day before she was murdered. She said, "We could try to stay here, but something is going to wind up happening. Other recordings of Dolores were played, where she could be heard saying, "As long as I stay here, I'm not going to be able to get away from him. I need to get out of Edna. I don't know what else to do." Augustine Tristan pled guilty to the crime. He confessed to killing Dolores with a 12-inch crescent wrench, after being refused a handgun earlier in the day. According to forensic witnesses, Dolores received at least 21 blows by the wrench, mostly to her head, arms, and hands. I assume that blows to her arms and hands were defensive wounds as she tried to protect herself from him. Tristan and his attorney, Kelsey Downing, spent the sentencing phase trying to convince jurors that he attacked Dolores out of a sudden passion. In the state of Texas, this is a defense that can only be invoked during the punishment phase of the trial and cannot be used to establish guilt or innocence. In order for a crime to be considered a crime of sudden passion, an offense needs to be not premeditated, and it must be shown by a preponderance of the evidence that it's due to adequate cause. In Texas, adequate cause is defined as a cause that would commonly produce a degree of anger, rage, resentment, or terror in a person of ordinary temper, sufficient to render the mind incapable of cool reflection. The prosecutor, Stephen Tyler, argued that Tristan was far from a person of ordinary temper, and presented several voice recordings as a rambling hothead, someone who blows his top when things don't go his way. It was a trait that witnesses testified were amplified by alcohol consumption. And I just want to say that from when I was in school, when I was in college for criminal justice, my degree, typically what this case is calling the adequate cause and sudden passion is what we would usually see as an example for the, I don't know the exact phrase for it, but the whole husband comes home and finds his wife cheating on him in bed with another man kind of explanation. Typically, that would be a second-degree murder charge, not a first degree. Essentially, the sudden passion is I just saw my wife cheating on me, and so I shot the other guy, and I killed him. That's typically what that example is used as, which with Augustine Tristan's case, that would not work. There's already proof of malice aforethought in that he had asked for a gun the day prior, or at least prior to committing the crime. The fact that he used the wrench and not the gun because no one gave him a gun shows me that that is one indication right there of malice aforethought. Thus, the sudden passion explanation would not work. Witnesses on the defense's side said that Tristan was a troubled veteran who left for war and came back damaged. In the voice recordings, Tristan could be heard making threats to the lives of several people, some veiled and some explicit. And one, Megan Childs, who has a child with Augustine Tristan, described calling police after Tristan threatened her teenage child. Tristan can be heard saying, "Just so you know, that was a stupid move for you." Later, he boasted that he could hurt whoever he wanted and that Jackson County Jail can't touch me. Recorded phone calls to his parents after his arrest for the murder were also played, revealing that Tristan became increasingly belligerent about the fact that his parents didn't plan to bond him out of jail. He claimed that if they paid to get him out, he may get a lower sentence. This, of course, is not how bond works. Bond is essentially just a guarantee that you'll show up to the arraignment and not flee the area before the trial. Many bail bondsmen will work with people to pay, usually at least, from Texas that I know of, about 10% of what the court posted, but this has no determination over one's sentence or conviction. Whether Tristan made the claim up himself or believed a false rumor is unknown. I would also like to point out that even if Tristan's parents went to a bail bondman, they would still have to pay $50,000, which is much more than what any regular person would have in their savings. Augustine Tristan's mother could be heard refusing in one recording, saying, "You beat us up all the time. You're always beating your dad up." Augustine then went on about his hopes for pleading insanity. In February 2022, there was a phone call from jail where Tristan demanded again that his parents post bond, ostensibly, or under the ruse, to see his daughter. When his mother pointed out that the child's mother would likely not allow him to see the child due to legal actions, he said, "Oh, I'm gonna see my daughter. I don't give a fuck if I have to kill Meg or not. Russ might get it too." Russ being Megan Childs' husband during this time period. Tristan then made the grandiose statement, "God has no control over what I do." And apparently there were more statements such as that. Even when Augustine's father didn't argue back, he simply stating things like, "Okay, Augie." Augustine continued to yell at his parents and call them names. He ended the call with "fuck y'all." Relatives of Tristan testified that this wasn't even the first time he assaulted somebody with a wrench. Years ago, he was convicted of assaulting somebody by hitting them in the head with a wrench similar to the one that he used to murder Dolores. An uncle testified that Tristan once assaulted him and smashed his phone. On May 26, 2022, the prosecution rested after almost 4 days of testimony. On the 27th, the defense called Diane Tristan, which is Augustine's mother, who described her son as a happy individual who went off to war and came back damaged. She said he wasn't the same after he returned from the military. Tristan took the stand himself as the final witness and had to be corrected by Judge Bell several times for rambling and going on tangents about killing Dolores, saying he just wanted to get things over with. He alternated crying and making forceful, boisterous statements like, "I could have fought this case and probably won." He also recalled the murder and saying to Dolores, "Now look what I gotta do," before bludgeoning her to death. During his testimony, Prosecutor Tyler asked Tristan if he had been in a lot of fights in jail. Augustine replied, "I am not the one to fuck with, Mr. Tyler." In closing statements, Prosecutor Tyler said the jury had a responsibility to review the evidence and decide if someone who said things like, "God can't stop me," "Jackson County can't stop me," was someone they'd want let back out into the streets at any time in the future, and urged them to sentence him to life in prison. The jury ruled on May 27, 2022, that Augustine Tristan was convicted of murder and would spend life in prison, and he owed a $10,000 fine. For some reason I do not understand, he was given the possibility of parole. I'm not sure if maybe that was something they had agreed upon before the trial. Augustine Tristan will not be eligible for parole until October 4th, 2051. By that time, he would be 66 years old. As of July 2024, he is incarcerated at Caulfield Facility, which is around Tennessee Colony, Texas. In 2023, Tristan tried to appeal his conviction, and he asked for a reversal, believe it or not. The appeal tried to state that there were 3 issues. The first being that the trial court failed to admonish him on the range of punishment. Second being the trial court committed harmful error by not making the findings required before accepting the plea. And third being that we must reverse the conviction because the record is completely silent about whether Tristan knew the constitutional rights he was waiving by his guilty plea and whether his plea was voluntary. This was in what you would call a memorandum, or memorandum, as I like to just say. The memorandum described the points that Tristan tried to make, and they refuted the contentions he had. For the sake of brevity, I won't actually read out the whole entire thing because it's a lot of legalese that just I don't think would make a lot of sense and would probably make you fall asleep in a bad way. But I will try to summarize. In his first contention, Tristan asserted that he was not informed of the range of punishment to pleading guilty to murder as required by the Texas Code of Criminal Procedures, Article 2613. This code essentially was stating that prior to accepting a guilty plea, the trial court is to admonish the defendant with the range of punishment. In other words, the law is supposed to tell you the amount of time that a conviction would send you to prison for. Augustine Tristan was trying to claim that he was never told of this range before pleading guilty. In the memorandum, it stated that appellant argues that if he did not actually know that, at the maximum, the jury could assess his punishment at life in prison, then clearly, the trial judge's failure to explicitly admonish appellant about the range of punishment is almost certainly material. That's kind of just a funny way of saying you should have paid attention. To translate, Augustine Tristan was claiming that he didn't know that pleading guilty to murder could range from life in prison with the possibility of parole to other types of consequences, which is just ironic considering that the state of Texas, we have the death penalty and we carry it out for murder. This is my own speculation. But I think that his lawyer told him to plead guilty so that he wouldn't get the death penalty, because sometimes there are sort of bargains that they do. Typically, really, a trial is kind of a last resort, and the court tries to have lawyers, essentially. They try to do plea bargains so that they could kind of just skip the trial and just get to a conclusion. So this is my own speculation, but I think that essentially his lawyer told him to plead guilty, and maybe the court was like, okay, you plead guilty, you won't get the death penalty, but you might still be able to get life. Now, the second contention that Augustine Tristan was trying to claim was that his conviction should be reversed because the court failed to make required findings pursuant to Article 2613 prior to accepting the appellant's guilty plea. Specifically, the appellant argues that it was a reversible error for the trial court not to inquire about the appellant's mental competence. And to sum it up, as this just starts to get into more and more legalese, Augustine Tristan's second contention, if you could really even call it that, is that the conviction should be reversed because nobody asked him if he was mentally competent to stand trial. Now, let us not forget that in a recorded phone call, he had expressed his hopes of using the insanity plea. And I've written this down. Later on, you could read this in the blog post to go more in detail. But essentially, the court in the memorandum rejected this. The court rejected his, I guess you would say, insanity plea after the fact, because that's how it came off to me, stating, I will have to read this quote because it was actually quite funny. The court in the memorandum decided to kind of put these points together in refuting his contentions. And so this first quote says, in our review of the record as a whole, we must determine whether the defendant was aware of the particular information upon which he should have been admonished. So they went through the entire record, everything that was recorded before the trial and during, to see if there was ever any indication, the admonishment, so to speak, if anybody ever told him what the range of punishment was for him filing or pleading guilty. Now, the court does admit that they did not tell him directly the punishment, but they went into the record, into what is called voir dire, the voir dire process, or as the layman might think of it as jury selection, really. So they went to the record for the people that were on jury duty when they were selecting the jury. And it was essentially saying that during the voir dire process, the prosecutor and Augustine Tristan's defense counsel brought up the punishment for murder. And it goes into the mental competence after this quote. But it's really funny how this was used as a point and yet so easily brought down. To quote, first was the prosecutor that had stated, "Now, murder is a first-degree felony. It has a range of punishment of life or not more than 99 years or less than 5 years." And of course, the note that is posted at the end of one of these sections states that Augustine Tristan's own counsel informed the jury selection that the punishment range was 5 to 95, 5 to 99, or life. That is a big range, okay? And legislature provides that big of a range because murder, a scary word, can happen in a lot of different fashions. And then both sides, the defense and the prosecutor, asked the veneer, the jury panel or jury selection, if they were able to follow the full range of punishment. And I can attest to that as somebody that, has had jury duty in the state of Texas. They ask you, would you be able to convict? Well, essentially, I don't have to get into the legalese for the video, but during jury selection, you are asked, would you be able to convict somebody, for life, to agree to lie for 99 years? You're asked that. And so, as somebody that's gone through, for a totally different case, not this one, jury duty myself, it makes me laugh thinking that because they will have, I don't know how it is in other states, but in the state of Texas, there's the jury selection or people that are there for jury duty before they officially select who's going to be on the panel. The prosecutor, the defense attorney, and then the accused, the person who is going to court. And so the point is that during jury duty, the person that this whole trial is going to be set up for is right there. They're sitting at a table, just doing nothing. So it's ironic that both sides, his own defense counsel stated, yes, for murder, there is a range of 5 to 95, 99 years, or even life in prison. And Augustine Tristan tried to say in his appeal that nobody told him. Nobody apparently told him. Now, it was over in Section C. I don't know why they skipped B, but I assume that Section B was probably maybe just not allowed for the public to see. But in Section C is where the memorandum goes over the mental competence issue of Augustine Tristan's appeal. And this is where you kind of can't help but laugh because this is all just so dumb. But Section C went over the mental competence of Augustine Tristan, saying that it was undisputed that the trial court did not ask him any questions of his mental competence. As said before, he was trying to say that nobody ever asked him if he was mentally competent to stand trial, so his conviction should be reversed. Now, the court refutes that, saying, yes, no, we didn't ask him if he was mentally competent to stand trial. However, as I will read here, the quote says, defendants are presumed to be competent to stand trial. If the defendant's mental competency is not an issue at the time of a guilty plea, the trial court is not required to inquire or hear evidence on that issue, and it is not an error to accept the guilty plea. The Court of Criminal Appeals has upheld that even when a defendant has had past mental health issues that are raised in trial court, the defendant's competence becomes an issue only if there is evidence of recent severe mental illness, at least moderate retardation, or bizarre acts by the defendant. Appellant did not argue in the trial court and does not argue on appeal that he was mentally incompetent at the time of his guilty plea, nor does he cite evidence suggesting that his mental competency was an issue at that time. Instead, he simply suggests the trial court has an obligation to always inquire into the matter sua sponte. Sua sponte essentially means of his or her own accord. Really, there was no reason for the court to inquire about Tristan's mental capacity or competency out of nowhere, because his own legal counsel never said anything or even hinted at any sign of incompetency. And that's where that comes down to. That's what this point comes down to. Let's not forget. Sorry, I thought there was a bug on me. Let's not forget, Augustine had toyed with the idea. He had expressed in a phone call to his mother that he would like to try the insanity plea, insanity defense. And after his conviction, as many narcissistic people that are convicted do, they end up realizing, I'm really here for life. Oh my God. We have to change this. No way. And so he tries in an appeal to say, well, nobody told me it would be life in prison. And nobody asked if I was mentally competent to begin with. And it's so nice to see the legal system actually do what it's supposed to and keep those who are not supposed to be out, keep them in. And so this appeal, I'm summarizing over this. If you want to read this, I will have all of the details in the blog post. But that's what that appeal was about, where essentially he tried to say that he tried to weasel his way out of it with contentions that did not make any sense. And really, his own defense counsel failed him, because if he really wanted to try the insanity plea, he should have either said that to his legal defense, which I don't know if he ever did, or he should have maybe tried harder to go that route. I'm not sure if he had his own attorney or a public defender. I think he might have had a public defender, but either way. I'm assuming that whether it's a public defender or not, his defense counsel probably already knew the insanity plea wouldn't have worked anyway. And let us not forget, and one day I'll make a video about this, but the insanity plea is very hard to use successfully in court. In fact, it's so rare, I can only think of one case that it kind of worked, but it's quite disputed today, which is of John Hinckley Jr. I believe that's his name. Now, there's plenty of other people that have tried to use it. Another, off the top of my head, we could think of very easily is John Wayne Gacy, who tried to use the insanity plea when he went to court, but of course that failed horrifically. The success rate is incredibly low, even when used in a trial itself. And of course, the insanity defense doesn't mean you get off scot-free. Someone like John Hinckley Jr. ended up in a mental health facility for decades. And that's how it works. You don't just not have any consequences to your actions. If somehow you were found mentally incompetent, or the insanity defense actually worked for your case because you were actually legally insane or whatever, you would still have to have some sort of treatment, rehabilitation, essentially a consequence to that action that you committed. Now, the idea that Tristan could try to weasel himself out of prison by claiming that he didn't know the punishment for murder could be life in prison, it's repugnant. His argument that he was not mentally competent to understand what a guilty plea meant only exemplifies his ignorance and a lack of education. It's clear that Augustine Tristan is a narcissistic abuser who used brute force to get his way in life without ever needing a shred of intelligence. He obviously never counted on the legal system being able to see right through him like a glass buffoon. He never showed any remorse for his actions. He never conveyed any remorse for killing Dolores. I never read anything about it. No remorse. He even tried to use his own child as an excuse for trying to get out of jail, admitting to potentially murdering her mother if he got out, her mother and her stepfather, if he didn't get his way. To me, it's clear that Augustine Tristan never had to take accountability ever in his life. Where does one learn to beat on others? Where do they learn to beat on their parents, girlfriends, and other people? A short stint in the military doesn't do that. If anything, I would say that the military instills accountability in you. I have friends and family that are veterans. Much of my work history has actually consisted of working with veterans that have been deployed in wars, and they are not like Tristan. I know that is anecdotal. I know it's anecdotal to say, well, I know veterans, but I do. I know it's anecdotal, but these people that I've known and grown up with my entire life, this other culture, I guess you could even say, if you understand military culture, you know that people like Augustine Tristan are not the norm. They are not normal at all. I know how anecdotal that is, but honestly, I am really sick and tired of hearing sorry excuses of people like Augustine Tristan blaming their time enlisted as the reason why they are a piece of shit. If being deployed caused all the problems in your life when coming home, why wouldn't you get help? There are resources out there for veterans. How does this justify or provide any explanation towards murdering your estranged girlfriend? If the military was the reason why Tristan became angry and violent, why wasn't that used as a stronger contention in the trial? Why didn't he or his family maybe sue the army for damages he went through? If he had horrible PTSD that caused him to lash out on others, why didn't he go to the VA and make that a part of his disability rating? I say this as someone who had the displeasure of meeting Augustine Tristan and being around his presence in real life. A few years before he committed the murder, he actually lived across the street from me, believe it or not. I don't want to dox myself, but he rented a house in town that was owned by one of the most notorious and worst slumlords in the area. The landlords are so scummy that no one ever finishes the lease. Every tenant breaks the lease because the house is in terrible shape and the owners don't fix anything. Ironically, Augustine Tristan is the only person that ever finished the lease. At least in the past 5 years, I'll say that much. But he was always a nuisance, loud enough to hear him yelling into his phone from across the street. It was like he had no sense of self-awareness, nor an understanding of boundaries, which, in a way, really isn't surprising. He would just come onto the properties of people who lived around him like as if this was the Legend of Zelda or something like that. He'd come onto my property at times. He'd try to hang out with my husband and his friends. And thankfully, we were able to chase him off by dumping fish fertilizer in the yard and giving him warm beer. And I know that sounds funny, but it really worked. Even still, there was something off about him. There was just something about him. This was someone who was just overall unlikable. He was arrogant and stupid and didn't know what he was talking about. I always got a weird vibe from him, and I'd avoid him whenever I could. And it turns out my instinct was right. Strangely, he was never rude to me. And thankfully, he was never rude or mean to me. And he seemed to be intimidated by me. I'm not sure what that says about me. Maybe it's just because I'm taller than him. I don't know. The last time I ever saw Augustine, I was on a walk. And for some reason, he decided he was going to try to talk to me. Not like I was in the mood to talk to him, of all people. And he just went on about nothing. Like as if I would be in the mood to listen to rambling. All I distinctly remember telling him was to go to the VA, to have his disability rating checked if he was having multiple problems in his life. Because if you know about military culture or whatever, veterans in the VA, I can at least tell you that he was not 100% disabled. He was not 100%. And he was complaining about things. I was like, well, why don't you go to the VA? Maybe you could try to get close to it, right? But obviously that never happened. He had talked about moving into an RV park in Ganado, and not that I asked. And that RV park is where the police found him after the murder. It's scary to think about, having been around a future murderer. It is. It is creepy. It's creepy to think, like, yeah, that guy would try to be on my property, would walk onto the sidewalk and all that, you know. It's creepy, but I'm very glad that I listened to my instinct. My instinct told me to stay far, far away from him. I don't know why Augustine Tristan was given the possibility of parole. I really don't. But I hope that he never gets out. And I hope that parole is never granted.